In America, that the pop star Michael Jackson has died.
Update you now on tonight's breaking news. Multiple media outlets are now reporting that pop singer Michael Jackson has died.
The last image anyone at the Staples Center had of Michael Jackson was a good one. He had ridden the cherry picker lift to its highest point above the stage floor, looked down at the crew assembled below him, and smiled. By every account from people who were present that night, dancers, musicians, production staff, the June 24th rehearsal had ended on a genuine high. His voice was clear. He had run through Billie Jean and Earth Song with focus and precision. He was joking between takes, the easy rapport of someone who felt at home in the work. Director Kenny Ortega, watching from the floor, saw nothing that alarmed him. When the rehearsal wrapped just after midnight, Jackson thanked the room, climbed into his waiting SUV, and was driven into the quiet streets of Los Angeles. None of the people who watched that convoy pull away knew they were watching the last performance of his life. What followed across the next 14 hours, inside a rented Holmby Hills mansion, in an upstairs bedroom that had been quietly converted into something no bedroom should ever be, constitutes one of the most examined and contested sequences of events in the history of celebrity death. A physician was present who was not qualified for what he was doing. A pharmacological cocktail was assembled that had no place outside a clinical setting with full monitoring equipment. A man who was frightened, alone, and desperately seeking the only sleep he believed was available to him pleaded for something that would stop his heart. By 2:26 in the afternoon on June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was dead. The story of those final hours is not simply a story about medical negligence, though it is certainly that. It is a story about the architecture of pressure, financial, professional, physical, psychological, that had been building around one person for years, and about the specific ways in which every system that should have protected him failed to do so, one after another in sequence until there was nothing left to catch him. The house on Carrollwood Drive. The property at 100 North Carrollwood Drive was a chateau-style home in Holmby Hills, one of the most affluent neighborhoods in Los Angeles, leased by Jackson at considerable monthly expense during the months of tour preparation. It was designed for the kind of quiet that is impossible to find when you are the most famous performer alive and 50 concerts at the O2 Arena in London are approximately 6 weeks away. The household operated on a strict economy of information. Every staff member had signed confidentiality agreements. Internal doors were kept locked. On the night of June 24th, the property was running its usual late routine when the convoy arrived after midnight. Chef Kai Chase had prepared dinner, though Jackson ate little. His appetite had been unreliable for weeks. His 3 children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were asleep in their rooms on another floor, insulated from whatever was happening around them. A nanny was present. Security staff monitored the perimeter. Dr. Conrad Murray was already upstairs. Murray, a cardiologist by training with no anesthesiology credentials, had been hired specifically for the tour period at a reported monthly salary of $150,000. His primary function, as it had evolved, was managing Jackson's sleep. Jackson had struggled with insomnia throughout his professional life. Colleagues from the Dangerous Tour 2 decades earlier recalled him remaining awake for multiple consecutive days until exhaustion produced hallucinations, and by 2009 the problem had become critical. The solution Murray was providing was propofol, a powerful general anesthetic that Jackson called his milk and had come to believe was the only thing that could reliably shut down his nervous system long enough for him to rest. Murray had been ordering propofol from a Las Vegas pharmacy in substantial quantities, more than 4 gallons in the weeks before Jackson's death, and having the deliveries sent to his girlfriend's apartment. He was operating what amounted to a nightly sedation clinic inside a private residence, without the monitoring equipment that clinical propofol administration requires, without the emergency response capability that such equipment would support, and without the formal records that any legitimate medical practice maintains. That night, the situation was worse than usual. Jackson had not slept properly in days. The rehearsal schedule extended regularly past midnight and required full physical exertion. The weight of the tour's financial structure was bearing down. His contract with the promoter included provisions that held him personally liable for any breach, including non-appearance. He needed sleep to function, and sleep was not coming on its own. 9 hours of sedation. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on June 25th, Murray began working through what the prosecution at his subsequent trial described as an escalating sequence of sedative administrations. He started with 10 milligrams of oral diazepam, a standard benzodiazepine, taken as a pill, intended to induce relaxation. Produced no observable sleep. At 2 a.m., he administered 2 milligrams of lorazepam intravenously. At 3 a.m., another 2 milligrams of the same drug. Jackson remained awake, agitated, and asking for his milk. At 5 a.m., Murray introduced midazolam, a benzodiazepine with stronger sedative properties, injected at 2 milligrams. Sleep did not come. Over the next several hours, he continued administering additional doses of midazolam, cycling through combinations that any clinical pharmacologist would have recognized as building toward a dangerous respiratory burden. Each drug in the sequence depresses the central nervous system's control of breathing. Stacked together, they create a compounding effect that narrows the safety margin considerably. By 10:40 in the morning, Jackson had been awake through 9 hours of failed sedation attempts. He was, by Murray's own later account, screaming for relief. Every medication administered through the night had produced no sleep and had saturated his system with substances that suppressed his respiratory drive. Murray administered 25 milligrams of propofol. The drug entered through the intravenous line, reached the central nervous system within seconds, and achieved what 9 hours of other sedatives had not. Jackson's breathing slowed. His eyes closed. He lost consciousness. He never regained it. The pharmacological explanation is not complicated. Propofol does not produce restorative sleep. It renders the patient unconscious through a mechanism fundamentally different from natural sleep, and it does so while suppressing the respiratory system. When combined with the benzodiazepines that had been accumulating in Jackson's system for 9 hours, the effect on respiratory function was predictably catastrophic. His brain was deprived of adequate oxygen. Cardiac arrest followed. The autopsy would confirm lethal concentrations of propofol in his system alongside lorazepam, midazolam, diazepam, and lidocaine, the local anesthetic Murray had apparently used to reduce the burning sensation propofol causes at the injection site. His internal organs, when examined, were in remarkably healthy condition for a 50-year-old man. His heart showed no disease. His liver was undamaged. His arteries were clear. He was killed not by the accumulated toll of his lifestyle, but by a specific and preventable sequence of clinical errors made by the one person in that house whose professional obligation was to protect him. The half hour that condemned a physician. The gap between when Murray understood that something was wrong and when emergency services were finally called is the most damaging single element in the case against him. Murray's account placed his discovery of Jackson's condition at approximately 11 a.m., when he said he returned from the bathroom and found the patient unresponsive with a faint pulse. The 911 call that eventually summoned paramedics was placed at 12:21 p.m., a gap of over 80 minutes. Phone records introduced at trial provided a partial accounting of how that time was spent. At 11:49 a.m., Murray placed a call to Saad Anding, a cocktail waitress, and remained on the line for approximately 32 minutes. Anding testified that at some point during the call, the phone went quiet. Murray had apparently set it down without disconnecting, and she could hear muffled sounds and what she described as coughing in the background. Murray also left a voicemail for another patient during this interval. When bodyguard Alberto Alvarez was finally summoned to the bedroom, the scene he encountered contradicted Murray's version of events on several material points. Murray had described Jackson as having a faint, warm pulse when he found him. Alvarez described a body with cool skin, open and fixed eyes, and a urinary catheter still attached, physical indicators consistent with a significantly longer period of oxygen deprivation than Murray's timeline admitted. Forensic analysis of the scene found no evidence of rigor mortis, but the physical evidence from the body suggested that Jackson had been deprived of oxygen for a considerably longer period than Murray acknowledged. The absence of monitoring equipment meant there was no objective record of when the respiratory crisis had actually begun. Before calling 911, Murray instructed Alvarez to collect the 4-bag from the pole and pack the propofol vials into a bag. Activities that consumed additional minutes from whatever window might have remained for intervention. Paramedics who arrived were not informed that propofol had been administered. They responded to a cardiac arrest of unknown cause. The phone call and what it captured. The 911 call placed by Alvarez at 12:21 p.m. was played in court during the trial and became one of the most significant pieces of evidence the prosecution presented. The call was frantic and brief. Alvarez identified the address and stated that a patient was not breathing. The dispatcher asked where the patient was. When Alvarez confirmed Jackson was in the bed, the dispatcher immediately instructed that he be moved to the floor, a standard instruction, because CPR performed on a soft surface dissipates the compression force and renders chest compressions largely ineffective. Murray, audible in the background, could be heard asking whether anyone in the room knew how to perform CPR. This detail stopped people in the courtroom. The man who had been hired to provide medical care to one of the most famous people alive, the only physician present at the scene of a cardiac emergency, was asking bystanders whether anyone knew basic resuscitation technique. When Murray did perform compressions, he used a single hand rather than the standard two-handed technique, and placed his other hand beneath Jackson's back in an apparent attempt to compensate for the soft mattress surface, an improvisation that further compromised the effectiveness of the compressions. The dispatcher's instructions were clear. Murray did not follow them. Los Angeles Fire Department paramedics arrived at 12:26 p.m. They found Jackson on the floor of the bedroom in a state of asystole, no cardiac electrical activity, fixed and dilated pupils, skin temperature that suggested the crisis had begun well before the call was placed. Paramedic Richard Senneff noted that the room felt arranged in a way that struck him as peculiar, with the 4 lines still attached as if medical intervention were actively underway, despite the physical evidence suggesting otherwise. Standard resuscitation protocols were applied. A defibrillator was attached. No shockable rhythm was present, so no shocks could be delivered. Epinephrine and atropine were administered. Jackson showed no response to any of these interventions. Murray identified himself to the paramedics as Jackson's personal physician and insisted that transport to the hospital be initiated rather than a field pronouncement of death. The paramedics, professionally obligated to defer to a physician's instruction at the scene, complied. The ambulance departed for UCLA Medical Center at 1:07 p.m. at standard road speed, without lights or sirens. The paramedics had assessed the patient as non-viable. There was no clinical urgency to their pace. UCLA and the official moment. The trauma team at UCLA Medical Center that received Michael Jackson at 1:14 p.m. mounted a full resuscitation effort under the direction of emergency physician Dr. Rochelle Cooper. Central lines were established. CPR was continued. Cardiologists joined the effort. Every resource the facility had available was brought to bear. Murray stood in the corner of the room. Witnesses described him as visibly distressed and reluctant to participate in the declaration of death that everyone else in the room understood was the only realistic outcome. At 2:26 p.m., after an hour of sustained intervention that produced no cardiac response, Dr. Cooper formally declared Michael Jackson dead. Outside the hospital, the situation had already begun to expand beyond the capacity of normal information management. Security had been positioned around the perimeter in response to gathering rumors. Family members who had received urgent calls were arriving. The infrastructure of celebrity death, the news helicopters, the camera crews, the wave of digital speculation, was assembling in real time. Inside the hospital, the formal processes of forensic documentation had begun. 2 days later, detectives conducted their initial interview with Murray. That interview would later become significant evidence in itself. Murray's account changed between his first conversation with investigators and subsequent testimony. He initially stated that he had not administered propofol to Jackson. When presented with purchase records from the Las Vegas pharmacy, more than 4 gallons ordered in the preceding weeks with deliveries addressed to his girlfriend's apartment, he revised his account, acknowledging that he had been administering propofol nightly for approximately 6 weeks. His explanation for the discrepancy was that Jackson had been pressuring him to provide the drug, and that he had been attempting to reduce the dependency gradually. He could not satisfactorily account for gaps in the timeline or for the absence of medication documentation. What the house contained. When law enforcement searched the Carrollwood property in the days following Jackson's death, what they found inside described the situation more clearly than any single witness account. In Murray's black medical bag, stored in a bedroom closet, investigators found 11 vials of propofol, 3 of them already empty. Bottles of lorazepam and midazolam were present, some opened. An oxygen tank with its regulator attached sat in the corner. The 4-pole in the bedroom still held a saline bag that had been cut open and was later determined to have contained a propofol solution, a delivery method that introduced additional risk because it removed the physician's ability to precisely control the dosage being administered. Additional medications were found distributed throughout the property in locations that suggested deliberate concealment. In a closet, in a diaper bag, in other hidden places. There was no patient chart, no formal medication log, no record of what had been administered when or in what quantities. No monitoring equipment was present, no capnography, no pulse oximetry. Devices that are mandatory accompaniments to any clinical propofol administration because they track the patient's respiratory status continuously and provide the earliest warning of impending respiratory crisis. What the house contained, in effect, was an improvised anesthesia suite operated by a physician practicing a medical specialty he was not trained or licensed to practice, on a patient who could not access standard clinical protections because the arrangement required secrecy to function. The pressure that built toward this. No account of what happened on June 25th is complete without addressing the conditions that made it possible. Jackson had entered the This Is It commitment carrying a financial structure that left him almost no margin for error. His estate carried debts approaching $400 million. The contract with the tour promoter included provisions that assigned personal liability to Jackson in the event of cancellation or non-performance. 50 consecutive London concerts represented both the financial solution and the source of an additional layer of pressure. To perform those shows, he needed to be physically functional. To be physically functional, he needed sleep. He had not been able to sleep without chemical assistance for an extended period. Kenny Ortega, the show's director, had flagged concerns about Jackson's physical state in internal communications days before the final rehearsal. He described a performer who was visibly fragile, thin in a way that was alarming, shivering in temperature conditions that no one else in the room found uncomfortable, sometimes unable to sustain the intensity that the rehearsals demanded. Those communications described someone who was struggling in ways that went beyond ordinary tour preparation fatigue. No one in the organizational structure around the show responded to those concerns with the intervention they called for. Murray, for his part, was operating under his own set of pressures. His monthly compensation was substantial and was contingent on the tour proceeding. His role gave him access and proximity that would not exist without it. He had agreed to manage a situation, Jackson's insomnia, using a method that should never have been deployed in a non-clinical setting, and he had constructed a private arrangement that depended entirely on secrecy. When that arrangement finally exceeded its limits, he had no system in place to manage the consequences. Jackson himself knew what propofol was and what it did. He was not naive about the pharmaceutical landscape of his own situation. But he was also a person in profound distress who was running out of options, who trusted the physician present to keep him safe, and who had no reason to believe that asking for the only thing that had been giving him rest would be the last request he ever made. What remained? By mid-afternoon on June 25th, the gates of the Carrollwood mansion had been closed. Jackson's children had been quietly removed by the nanny before anyone formally informed them of what had happened. The household staff was dismissed. Detectives moved through the rooms, photographing everything, cataloging what they found. In the kitchen, the breakfast Kai Chase had prepared for the children that morning sat largely untouched. The chef had been downstairs at 8 a.m. with no knowledge of what was happening on the floor above her. The first sign she had that something was wrong came just before noon, when she heard footsteps running on the stairs and Murray burst into the kitchen shouting for someone to call security and get Prince. She had found the children and moved them elsewhere before the paramedics arrived. In the foyer, an ornate golden throne, a prop from a music video, sat in the entrance. In the upstairs bedroom, forensic technicians worked the scene. Outside the property, news helicopters had taken up positions. Camera crews established themselves on the sidewalk. The digital infrastructure of public grief had already activated. Within hours of the first reports, the volume of internet traffic generated by people searching for information about Jackson's condition caused measurable slowdowns on major platforms, including Google and Twitter, a scale of simultaneous public response that had no prior equivalent. In the weeks that followed, 3 of his albums returned to the top 10 of the Billboard charts. The documentary assembled from rehearsal footage became the highest-grossing concert film ever released, earning more than $260 million worldwide. A memorial service at the Staples Center, the same building where he had taken that final cherry picker ride 14 hours before his death, drew an audience of nearly 17,500 in person and was viewed by an estimated 1 billion people internationally. The estate that had been burdened by enormous debt at the time of his death was transformed, through licensing agreements and posthumous releases, into one of the most valuable entertainment properties in the world. None of it answers what should have been a simple question. Why was a man with everything to live for, with more creative energy than the situation around him allowed to safely express, left alone in a locked room with a physician who lacked the equipment, the training, and ultimately the character to keep him alive? The 911 recording answered it partly. The autopsy answered it partly. The trial answered it partially in legal terms. What it added up to was a portrait of accumulated failure, of systems of care, of professional obligation, of the organizational infrastructure that surrounds enormous commercial enterprises and sometimes forgets that at the center of all of it is a human being who requires protection. Michael Jackson left the Staples Center that night having done the work exactly as it was supposed to be done. The rest was supposed to be someone else's job.